So here we can see a phylogenetic tree containing all plants. And we have our ancestral green algae, which would have been our outgroup out here. So from here on, everything is a plant. And we typically are going to divide these into three main categories for studying. The first group are the non-vascular plants, sometimes called the bryophytes. And this is going to contain three groups: the liverworts, the true mosses, and the hornworts. This is not a clade, this is a paraphyletic grouping here. And these are going to not have vascular tissue, meaning they don't have any tissues inside their body for transporting water or nutrients around inside the body. Almost every plant species has vascular tissue except for these kind of early to develop non-vascular bryophytes. Eventually vascular tissue did develop, so we can see the development of vascular tissue. So all of these branches make up the group called vascular plants, which is a monophyletic clade. And we're typically going to break this into two groups: those that do have seeds and those that do not have seeds. So the second group we'll look at is the seedless vascular plants, which is made up of two clades, the Lycophytes and the Monilophytes. And then eventually we will look at the seed plants. And there are two types of seed plants: gymnosperm, which gymno means naked, and these have seeds that do not enclosed in protective, they're surrounded by a protective coat to make a seed, but they're not enclosed in specific chambers. And then angiosperms develop inside of actual flowers. So we're going to start here with these three lineages are called the bryophytes, and you can see that this is that kind of branching here because this is not a monophyletic clade. There are three groups of bryophytes: Hepatophyta, which is containing the liverworts, and warts is just a word that means plant. The Bryophyta, which contains our true mosses, and where we get the name for this group, and then the Angiosperms, which contains a group called hornworts. So some characteristics of the bryophytes: they have a dominant gametophyte generation. These are the only groups, so this is important, that have a dominant gametophyte. And what I mean by dominant is it's big and it lasts longer. So if you were to look at a bryophyte plant, the actual leafy green plant that you're looking at is the gametophyte. And this is the only group where that's true. So you can see in my alternation of generations over here, there are male gametophytes and female gametophytes. And inside of them, they have those organs, the antheridia and the archegonia. A male gametophyte plant will release sperm into its environment, which is going to have to be a liquid because these are flagellated. And those sperm will eventually reach an egg and fertilize it. Inside of that female gametophyte, it's going to develop into a zygote. Here's my embryo, where the plants get that whole term embryophyte. And then this is going to turn into the sporophyte. And it actually stays within the gametophyte body. So this is my sporophyte right here. It's really tiny, and it produces the sporangium, which is one of those characteristics of plants, and then eventually produces sexually produced spores by meiosis. So we go back to haploid. Those spores are then going to develop either into a male gametophyte or a female gametophyte again. These do not have vascular tissue, so they don't actually have true roots. So instead what they have are these little branching structures that run pretty shallow under the ground called rhizoids. So rhizoids, instead of penetrating deep into the ground, are going to be very shallow under the surface and kind of branch out horizontally. A lot of these gametophytes are found as a carpet almost that hugs the ground, and that's because they don't have a lot of vascular structures to help support them in creating a very tall plant. So most of these are going to be very short plants that, instead of growing tall, are just going to grow wide and make large carpets across the ground. The sporophyte is a very small structure. So here in this picture, all you see is the gametophyte, and the sporophyte actually develops inside of the female gametophyte. and this produces a stalk. Once the sporophyte has developed spores and it's ready to release them, you can see here it's going to create a stalk called the seta, and the spores are stored here in this capsule. The opening of this capsule actually is called a peristome. Stoma means mouth, and this is going to allow for gradual dispersal of the spores. So it's got little teeth-like structures that when they're dry, they allow for the spore dispersals, but when they're moist, they actually close and prevent dispersal of the spores. So you can see most of the green leafy part of this plant is actually the gametophyte, and the sporophyte is only a short, temporary, and small structure on this plant. This is the only group where the dominant generation is the gametophyte. True mosses can be extremely important in our environment. They're usually common in things like moist forests and wetlands. You would expect to find bryophytes in moist environments because they need water in order to reproduce because of the sperm being flagellated. One example of a moss is called peat moss, and these form large deposits of organic material. So you can see all of this material is being farmed. This is peat moss. And what happens with peat moss is it's a partially decomposing material. So because it's really moist and typically low temperature, pH, oxygen, all those other things help to prevent the decay of the peat moss. So these are dead mosses from a long time ago that developed on the ground and then were covered over by other plants. And instead of decaying, they form these partially decayed peatlands. And these are often farmed for fuel sources in Europe and Asia. Because these are high in carbon, they can be burned as a fuel source. So by farming peatlands, we're actually taking large deposits of carbon dioxide that are stuck in the ground in the form of partially decomposed peat. And when we burn them, we're releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere, just like when we burn oil. Global temperature rising on the planet, so global climate change, is also causing the peatlands to start to decompose. So as they dry out, they become warmer, the level of water drop, and it exposes the peat down underneath the ground to the air, and it starts to decompose them. And as peat finishes its decomposing process, it's going to release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, then compounding the global climate change